Okay, welcome to section 5, and in this section we're going to take a look at Identity Server and add the ability for us to authenticate to our API endpoints that need authentication. So in this section we are going to create an Identity Server project so that we have a way to authenticate to our API endpoints, and it's got some customizable parts to it and we're going to customize it to our needs. Now, just to set the expectations, this will not be everything that you could possibly want to know about Identity Server. We're going to use it for our needs to provide authentication and provide authentication for two clients. We're going to have a Postman client where we can test our API endpoints with authentication using Postman, and later we're going to have a client app where we can use that to authenticate to our API endpoints and use our Identity Server as the trusted token issuer to get a token and pass that on to our API endpoints. So we're going to take a look at adding authentication for that, and we're also going to take a look at what the standards Identity Server uses for the issuance of token and authenticating our users, and that uses the OpenID Connect standard and OAuth 2. So I'm not expecting you to have covered this in any detail before, so in a lesson after this we're going to take a look at what OpenID Connect actually is, as well as OAuth 2, and the authentication flow that's going to occur in our application when a user requests a token by logging in to Identity Server. And let's take a look at the big picture stuff. Where does this fit into our microservices application? Well, I've tried to keep it separate, and I've done that by not adding it to the rest of them down here, where we have things like the gateway that's coming up and other things. I want you to think of Identity Service as something separate. We're covering it in this application due to my desire not to have reliance on any kind of cloud service so that we can run everything locally. If I was going to pick an alternative, I'd probably use Azure Active Directory Business to Customer service, because then we don't need to worry about something significant like Identity Service, but that would have meant reliance on a cloud service, and I wanted everything to be running locally, and that gave me one of two different options. We either use something like Identity Service, or we just use a normal .NET app and add identity into it, but that would not be normal for a microservices application. And I wanted this microservice experience to be how it normally does work, where we would use an identity provider, and that's what Identity Service is going to be in our case, to provide the authentication for our microservices app. And an identity provider typically covers multiple different applications. We're just going to be using it for one, but it's going to operate outside our app, and we could use it for many other client applications as well. Possibly a bit of overkill for what we're doing here, but I did feel that this was necessary. And like I say, for an application of this size, if I only had one, then I probably would not use Identity Server to achieve that. I'd probably use a cloud service to do such a thing. And it's purely because my goal to have everything running locally that I settled on using Identity Service here. It's not going to connect to our service bus, and it's not really going to be part of our microservices application. It's not going to receive requests through a gateway or an ingress, as our other requests will eventually do. It's going to operate in its own place. But we are going to be creating it as another project within our solution, even though that's not technically how it's going to function within our app. And you'll see all of that as we build what we're building. So what actually is Identity Server then? Well, it's an authentication server, and it implements two standards, the OpenID Connect standard and OAuth 2.0 standard. We are going to look at those in more depth in the next lesson. And unlike other methods of single sign-on, like Facebook, for example, Facebook login, or possibly Azure Active Directory Business to Consumer, they're not really that customizable, but Identity Server is designed to be a customizable solution, so you have control over all aspects of authentication regarding what you're using this for. Unfortunately, it's no longer open source. It did used to be, and that meant you could use it without a license, but now it is no longer open source, and comes under Duende Identity Server. That's the company that was formed by the guys who made this product. And due to it becoming pretty much a full-time job for them, they were no longer able to use an open source design for this because they had trouble getting sponsorship, things like that. And since it was a full-time job, they took the approach where it needs to be licensed. Don't worry about this. We do not need a license for what we're doing. We're okay to use this for trading and testing purposes. It's just that if we ever put our application into production, then we would need a license. And even then, it's still possible to get a free license for this if the business does not make more than $1 million, I think it is. But you can get a license from them for free unless your business that you're using it for is earning more than $1 million per year. But for our purposes, we're okay to use this as it is. And we'll take a look at that when it comes to installing Identity Server. And Identity Server is a single sign-on solution. So typically, you would not use something like Identity Server for a single app authentication. And the goal of this really is to get around what users have become tired of, which is having separate logins for separate applications, where they have to sign up, fill out a form just to get into a single application. Nowadays, a lot of people, including myself actually, have become tired of having different logins for different applications. Nowadays, I just click the single sign-in option, which would typically, in my case, just be Apple or GitHub or something along those lines. But people do expect a single sign-on solution to log into an application nowadays. Now, we're not actually going to look at Facebook login or Apple login or one of the other ones because, again, I wanted to keep everything running locally. So our single sign-on solution where one user has a single login for multiple apps, in our case, that's going to be Identity Server, even though it's only really going to be used for one application, which is the one we're building here. So that's what we're about to produce, but Identity Server uses a couple of standards that we need to understand because the authentication flow of how a user logs in, gets token, and authenticates to our app is something that we need to understand, or I feel we need to understand before we go ahead implementing this stuff. As Identity Server, whilst it's relatively simple to configure, it does hide a lot of this complexity, but if we run into trouble, it's helpful to understand how this system works, and we'll take a look at that next.